IVM.
Numbers saturate the news, politics, life. For good or ill, they are today's preeminent public language. And those who speak it rule. Quick and cool, numbers often seem to have conquered fact. But they are also hated, and often for the same reasons. They can bamboozle, not enlighten, terrorize, not guide, and all too easily end up abused and distrusted. Potent but shifty. The role of numbers is frighteningly ambiguous. How can we see our way through them? First, relax. Hello and welcome to States of Anarchy. I'm your host, Hamsini Hariharan, and every episode we try to break down issues in global affairs and foreign policy to make a little more sense of the world. What you heard at the beginning of this episode is an excerpt from the book, The Tiger That Isn't, by Andrew Dilnot and Michael Blasland. We're so used to taking a make or break approach to statistics. Take China, for example. Over the last couple of months, China has been lambasted for not releasing accurate coronavirus numbers. And this isn't a new phenomenon. Around the world, the lack of transparency about Chinese data has led to scholars and researchers questioning the reliability of the image that China presents to the world and itself. And all of this goes back to the formation of the People's Republic of China by the Communist Party. But what happens when we flip that assumption on its head and look at the story that the numbers do present to us? What does the process of statistics tell us about the outcome? And what does this have to do with India, which began doing path-breaking work in the field of statistics in the 1950s? For all of these questions, we turn to our guest for today's episode. Arunabh Ghosh is a historian of modern China. He is an associate professor of modern Chinese with the Department of History at Harvard University. His first book, Making It Count, Statistics and Statecraft in the Early People's Republic of China, was released earlier this year. It investigates how the early Chinese state built statistical capacity to know the nation through numbers. For the book, he conducted research in Beijing, Guangzhou, New Delhi, and Kolkata. In my conversation with Arunabh, we really get into how statistics was shaped during the early years of Chinese history before the Great Leap Forward, and the surprising connections between India and China during this period. We'll get into that in a minute. But first, a short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you're not following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Paytm Money and Intel. We appreciate their support. It's been a fantastic week on the IVM network. I hope that you've been checking stuff out, but some of the highlights that you definitely should check out. Ashish Vidyarthi, host of Begin the Journey, was on Cyrus Says. They had a really fun conversation. I think you'll enjoy that. Uncle Please Sid did an episode around development, which was really, really fun. On Edges and Sledges, we had Adam Holyoke, former England captain. While those guys are killing it, one cricketer after the other. Definitely do check out Advertising is Dead. We talk about esports with some really guys who really know that space. Smile India, absolutely right. These guys are killing it as well. So is Pawan at Pragati. Don't forget the Original Things. Again, one of my favorite shows. You must check that out. It's just been a really fun week, folks. So I hope that you enjoy it. And with that, let's get you back to your show.
Hi, Arunabh. Welcome to States of Anarchy. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
You know, when I was reading your book, the first thing that sort of came to mind for me was visiting the National Museum of China and looking through like these big charts that they had on the walls about the Great Leap Forward and how they grew so much during this time.
Right.
And it was just very interesting to me that your book sort of dealt with the same thing but through a very, very different lens. So why did you choose to do this? Why did you choose to study sort of the history of statistics in China when everybody around the world sort of acknowledges that there is manipulation of the data?
Right. I think so. This is actually a great question, and there's sort of several aspects to it. I think that make it very interesting. Let me talk specifically about the China side first, and then make a sort of broader point about why study the history of data itself. You know, whether in the Chinese context or not. But in the case of China, I think you're absolutely right. When we think of the 1950s in particular, even if we think more broadly of post-49 Chinese history, that is, China under communist rule, the Great Leap Forward looms very large, and it looms large on the one side because of this sort of very grand scheme for completely transforming China's economy. They claimed that within 15 years they would surpass steel production in the UK. and they would, very shortly also equal steel production in the US. So it was very grand in the imagination. But of course, on the flip side, we know that it led to a massive famine, and the number of people who died in that famine remains an extremely controversial number. There's an official Chinese state estimate, and then there's a whole range of estimates that scholars have tried to deduce starting in the early 80s. And this debate is ongoing, and the number, how large the number is, whether it's as low as 15 million, which is the Chinese official estimate, versus much higher estimates that go into actually the 40 millions. Where does this number lie? Because at its root is this question of, is the Chinese state legitimate if it has done so much violence to its own people in some ways? So in that sense, yes, you're absolutely right that when you think about 1950s China statistics, the Great Leap Forward immediately becomes the obvious thing to focus on. And part of what I try and do in the book and the way in which I approach the research was actually to avoid precisely that framing. And this is where sort of a basic historiographical or historical research methodology becomes important. I think in order to perhaps try and understand how people approached a set of problems, a particular moment, a particular event, I think we shouldn't always place our knowledge of what happened afterwards as a way of understanding those choices. Right. So this is what historians would call sort of not to sort of think teleologically, not because we know what is going to happen down the road, not to use our knowledge of what happens later on to interpret the choices that people are making who obviously had no idea of what was going to happen. And in the Chinese case, with the 1950s, what's interesting is that if you look at 1959, before, so the Great Leap Forward has been initiated for a year, but the famine really hasn't set in. And so in 59, there is a massive celebration because it's marking 10 years of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And all the charts that you saw in the National Museum, books are produced and other kinds of propaganda are produced to essentially celebrate the achievement of the first 10 years. At that point, it is still a largely positive story. They have come out of a whole set of challenges in the first half of the 20th century, and they have set forward on national reconstruction. A lot of that is successful. The economic growth is quite remarkable. So in, say, the spring or summer of 1959, things look pretty good, right? So how do you understand then, how do you justify the fact that things looked so positive at that time? And then, knowing that another 6 months, a year down the road, things completely collapse. So in order to understand that sense of optimism and that sense of achievement, I think we need to set aside our knowledge of the fact that things collapse and look at the choices that were being made throughout the course of the decade. So that's one reason, I think, to try and set aside, what we know is going to happen later on, whether it's catastrophic, whether it's actually a success, and understand sort of choices in their own time by people who obviously had no sense of the future. So that's one reason, I think, to look at an earlier period in the 1950s when it comes to statistics becomes really important. So that's sort of a statistics 1950s China reason for, I think, looking at an earlier period. And as I hope the book shows, you end up finding all sorts of very interesting sort of things that are happening that speak to, again, narrowly to Chinese history, but then also speak to all kinds of things that are happening globally in the history of data, in the history of statistics, and in the history of scientific exchange in the South, in the global South, which I'm hoping we'll get to talk about a little later. So setting aside the China side, I think the other part of your question, which is really interesting also, is why sort of study a place and a moment when we know that the data are manipulated, the data are biased in fundamental ways. And I think the important thing here is to take a step back and recognize that state manipulation, or even more broadly, private manipulation of data, is actually a fairly universal thing. Right? It happens in democratic societies. It happens in non-democratic societies. And, 6 months ago, perhaps I would have to do more explaining to defend at this point. But I think in this age of, or this moment of the coronavirus and COVID-19, I don't think this is a very controversial statement to make, because we're seeing all kinds of data fudging, all kinds of confusion that is being generated by data that don't agree with each other in India, in the US, in China, in Europe, everywhere. And I think so. The question that then emerges out of this is not so much should we study places where we know data is biased, but rather what are the mechanisms that generate data, right? And how do we understand those mechanisms? I guess, again, you can think of this in two ways. There's a question of methodology and a question then of what you can think of as assumptions. So in order to do this, think about it this way. Let's first accept that manipulation of data is a reality. Now, so the question then becomes, what is happening in specific places and how is that manipulation different? That is then sort of the more interesting question for us. And one of the things that I find in the book, and I think that I'm hoping people will consider as an important takeaway, is that you can think of at least two broad categories of data manipulation. One is where what you can think of as post hoc manipulation, right? So data, something has been produced, say GDP figures, or in our particular contemporary moment, the fatality rate with COVID-19 infections, and it's a number that the state is not happy with, or a particular hospital is not happy with, or a particular agency is not happy with. Okay, now let's massage the data so that it becomes more acceptable to us and so it's more easy for us to disseminate it. That's one kind of manipulation. That's a very common kind, and one that we should all be very concerned about. And I think states do it all the time. They do it with GDP, they do it with other kinds of things. But there's another kind of manipulation that's possible, and it's not necessarily, manipulation may not be the best word. It's you can think of this more as a bias. There's another set of biases that can sort of enter the way in which data is being produced, which emerges from certain sets of assumptions we make at the very beginning. And those assumptions about whether it's about methodology, whether it's about what precisely we are counting, can also have path dependencies that generate biases. And part of, I think, by looking at the mechanisms through which data gets produced, regardless of whether it's, as I said, a relatively democratic society or if it's a more authoritarian one, is to, I think, parse these different mechanisms, is to look at these different pathways through which data gets produced. And that, I think, leads to a much better understanding of both when things collapse, understanding how they've collapsed, and what the relevance of that collapse is. So I guess one pithy way to say this is that, we should accept that all data are biased, but they're not biased in the same way. And so the challenge then becomes, if they're not biased in the same way, it's then incumbent upon us to parse the ways in which, the mechanisms through which data gets produced.
That's a very interesting way to put it. One thing I think when it comes to China, maybe more than other countries, you have two sort of biases that comes to either China is lying about its data sort of retrospectively, and or it says, China had sort of this long plan and everything that has come now confirms that plan, sort of a confirmation bias of sort of the narrative that China also puts out. And I think falling prey to either of these would take away from maybe an accurate picture of what is happening. Not that it's possible to maybe find a perfectly accurate picture. Right. But I think the other thing is that people sort of look at numbers as holy, right? Like people sort of look at statistics as, these are the numbers and the numbers are the facts, and this is what we can glean through everything. And I think, going behind methodologies really breaks that down for us.
Absolutely. I think you raise a very important point. I think too many of us assume that the numbers represent some untainted, absolute, pure truth. But I think it's really important to recognize that we are the ones who are producing the numbers, right? And by we, I mean not just we as human beings, but we as an individual people, whether it's, say, an individual researcher, a group of researchers, an institution, the state, and everyone has both an agenda. It could be a research question, we're trying to understand something, or we're trying to actually hide something, right? So these are very much a part of, and then there are all sorts of things that are actually unexamined. There are assumptions that are just a part of being human, right? We have certain ways in which we think that have to do with the societies we are in, the kinds of, what the education that we've received has been like. So there's those biases that we can identify. There are those biases that we haven't really fully examined, and they all influence the ways in which we actually generate data. So you're absolutely right. I think the first step is, so when I said all data are biased, I think it's precisely that, accepting that there is no untainted, pure numerical truth out there that we can just go out there and grasp. The very process of going out there and grasping is dependent on a whole range of factors. And so part of this kind of research becomes a pursuit of what are those factors, why those factors and not other factors, and then what are the implications once we've discerned what those factors are.
And now that you brought that up, let's dive into statistics in China. So before the PRC, when China set up the Republican government, what were sort of the institutions that were put in place? What was the legacy of these institutions?
Yeah, so this is actually, it's interesting that you asked about the Republican years. So the Republic of China, which is typically, dated from 1912 to 1949. But I think what's interesting to recognize is that China has a much longer history, the imperial state of China, which, goes back, depending on how we count, at least 2 millennia. has a very long, and one would argue, if you compare it to other polities, its contemporaries, say in the first millennium or second millennium of the Common Era, if you compare it to those contemporaries of, it has a much, much more robust tradition of collecting statistical information. Now, of course, it wouldn't be exactly the kind of statistics that we think of today, because you have to think about imperial states and what they're interested in. But if you were to think of the kinds of things that a king and his court might be interested in, you'd think about, well, have the rains been good? Because in pre-modern times, these are all agrarian societies that heavily depend on rainfall for the annual crops. So to keep track of rainfall data, this is something that you actually see going back several hundred years in the imperial Chinese record. Similarly, prices of grains. If you're managing a very large empire, you want to have information about pricing across various different parts of the empire so that you can actually have a sense of economic stability, right? So these kinds of things you actually, in addition to the other things that a lot of states do count, which is people, not people so much families. For taxation purposes, for corvée labor, a lot of states had started counting how many people were in the empire and the kingdom. So what's interesting is that there's actually a very long legacy, and there's an economist at Tsinghua University in Beijing called Li Bozhong, who actually contends that the imperial Chinese state has actually the longest record of collecting statistical information of any state that we can think of, so in global history. So there is, in some ways, even in order to understand the Republican years, which is what your question was about, I think we need to acknowledge this even longer tradition of thinking about statecraft as partly composed of the collection of quantitative data, right? So not just descriptive data, but quantitative data. So part of what happens in the transition when the empire collapses, the Qing Empire collapses in 1912, and the Republic of China it collapses in 1911, and the Republic of China is set up in 1912, is that there is a debate about, well, what do we do with these longer practices of data collection? Now, the debate had already begun in the last few decades of the Qing Empire, but then when the Republic gets set up, there's a greater impetus to create new kinds of institutions, to think more in a more sort of concrete way about how do we approach statecraft, economic policy making, getting a sense of what the social and economic conditions in the country are. And there's a German scholar who's done really amazing work on this period. Her name is Andrea Bread, and she has sort of argued that there's an important transition that takes place at this time within state statistics, across this empire to republic transition in 1912. And in very simple terms, what she says is that before 1912, in the imperial tradition, a lot of what was being measured was really static. These were, what you can think of as stocks and not flows of data. So whether it's how much rainfall, there's a particular value, just this amount. What's the price of grain? It's this amount. And the transition that takes place partly is a way of thinking about data as being much more dynamic and a focus on, in simple terms, on trends, but going into then a whole range of other questions. So that's one transition that happens. It leads to the creation of a whole range of new state ministries that are tasked with pursuing this kind of data. And very influential in this transition, of course, is what has been happening in Japan, because as you will know, Japan was the first country in Asia to industrialize in the second half of the 19th century. So for a lot of Chinese elites, they looked towards Japan to see what was the Japanese experience like, what can we learn from them as we try and modernize our own empire and now republic. So that's the state side, state statistics, collecting data for planning, for policy making, and so on. But the other interesting transition that happens in the Republican years that's actually quite important is a sort of gradual expansion of contact with other parts of the world, in particular with Western Europe and the US. And this is a time in the history of statistics that's actually really, really fertile. The discipline of modern statistics, as we know it, really is born in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. So a lot of Chinese mathematicians and other social scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, economists, they become a part of this emerging global dialogue of what statistics ought to be, what are the key methods. So again, to give you a very quick example, some of the things that we take for granted today, right, like regression, correlation, these basic concepts, they actually emerge in the late 19th century. They're very, very new in terms of if you compare it to other sciences, for instance. And so there is this kind of interaction exchange, part of which includes a lot of Chinese young men and women going over to the US and to Europe to study, and then they return and then are professors or government officials and so on. So they become part of a really vibrant world of statistical and sort of economic discourse, if you will, right? So this is into the teens, 1920s and 1930s. And one of the hallmarks of this is really a transition that's happening more broadly in the history of statistics, which is what the philosopher and historian of science Ian Hacking has called the taming of chance, right? So the idea basically that we as human beings became comfortable with the idea of probability and uncertainty that exists in the real world. He says until the 19th century, really, what we were really not comfortable with the idea that there's uncertainty, and there's a I can't go into a lot of detail here, but the idea really is that a lot of this was ascribed then to divine will or other ways of sort of rationalizing things that we just cannot understand. And what happened in the late 19th century is through the development of essentially mathematical tools surrounding probability that we began to get a more and more concrete sense and a way of actually understanding how to measure the probability of certain kinds of events, the probability of certain kinds of outcomes. And that gave us a fundamentally different sense of how to think about our relationship to each other and to the natural world. So this is what he refers to as the taming of chance. And the fact that we became comfortable not just with the idea that there's uncertainty in the world, but there are ways in which we can ascertain the level of that uncertainty. So we can't be absolutely accurate, but we can determine within a range of error what the likely outcome is going to be, right? And this is largely because of the mathematical turn that statistics takes. And probability as a sub-discipline of both mathematics and then of statistics really develops in tremendous ways. So the Chinese, whether they're state officials or they're academics, economists, statisticians of the 1920s and 30s of the Republican era, are very much a part of this broader global discourse, which takes statistics as a fundamentally mathematical, a fundamentally probabilistic kind of science that then can be used to study pretty much any phenomena, whether it's social phenomena that speak to the natural world, or even to the extraterrestrial world, right? So if you're studying space, also you can apply statistical techniques in your research. So that's the broader background that exists in the Republican years. And the legacy of this into the PRC era, the People's Republic of China era, which is under communist rule, is interesting because part of what happens when the communists take over is that they explicitly reject this much more universal, much more probabilistic, much more mathematical approach to statistics. And they do that because they have their own understanding of statistics. They want to redefine it as not a universal science, but a social science whose sole task is the research and analysis of society, of human beings and their actions, right? So not the natural world, not the extraterrestrial world, and so on. And the reason they do this is because of their particular understanding of sort of Marxist theory and the ways in which history is supposed to unfold. They basically contend, again, to be somewhat reductive in representing how they arrive at this. They basically say, well, if you understand Marx, then you know that that we are all on this inevitable path towards a socialist society and then eventually towards communism. And as we see it, there is actually nothing uncertain about this progression, right? We're all going to end up there. It's just a question of figuring out where on this particular pathway we are. But once you accept that, then according to these Chinese statisticians, who were, of course, deeply in dialogue with Soviet statisticians and relying upon a lot of Soviet discussion on these subjects, they would say, well, if the path is known and if we know the end goal, then what place does uncertainty and chance and probability have in the social world? So once you make that distinction, you are able to say, well, therefore, the techniques and the methods we use in probabilistic methods ought not to have any place in the social science of statistics, right? So in some ways, the kind of statistical world that was, say, a feature of the Republican years is in many ways fundamentally rejected after 1949. So then the question becomes, what happens to these people, right? Many of these practitioners who were major figures, economists and statisticians of the 1930s and 1940s, and they follow a few different kinds of trajectories. Some of them actually moved to Taiwan along with Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government, and become active members in the scientific community there. There are some who stay on. Many of these people who stay on are marginalized. They play really no role in planning, in economic policy making, in any kind of social science in the 50s and 60s. The younger among them, after 1978, when there is a sort of openness to some of these methods again in the PRC, they are actually tapped and they become involved again in statistical work. But there's a whole period in which this community is largely marginalized. And the less lucky amongst them are not just marginalized, but they also become the targets of attacks in the 1950s, right? They become identified. They are labeled as bourgeois scientists, as bourgeois statisticians, promoting a false definition of statistics. So some of them then actually come under, by attack, I don't mean physical attack, but that also happened to other intellectuals in the 1950s and other common people too. But they come under serious attack from their peers. They lose jobs, they're marginalized, and they in many cases have to carry out public recantations where they essentially admit that their earlier approach to statistics was fundamentally flawed. And now they understand that statistics is a social science, it has nothing to do with probability and nothing to do with chance and uncertainty and so on. So the legacy is complicated because in the immediate term, there's a fundamental rejection, but after 78, there's again an openness and a return to sort of a greater degree of dialogue with the pre-49 tradition.
This is very fascinating for me because when you sort of look at the disruption between the nationalist government and then the communist government, it's very easy to see that, some of these statisticians, a lot of them would be caught up in the anti-rightist movement and things like that.
Right.
But I wonder then what sort of the starting point for a completely new statistical system would be like. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, though this is why, again, the first question you asked is such an important one, right? I think we wouldn't get to that question if we were being driven entirely by, say, a desire to understand the famine and the number of people who died and how did that happen. Because then we really focus on that immediate moment and, the mechanisms and the ways in which data was being collected and so on. But I think this originary story that you're alluding to really is also very important, right? Because it's only through this originary story do we discover this fundamental rejection of statistics as a universal science and a sort of a kind of discourse that emerges that says, no, we need to set up really a socialist statistics for a socialist society. And those debates really start happening immediately after the establishment of the PRC on October 1st, 1949, formally, or from the perspective of a large centralized state. But actually, those discussions have already been taking place because the communists in the 1930s and 1940s itself did control small pockets of area where they had begun to experiment in small-scale reforms, whether it's small-scale land reform, small-scale administrative reforms, and some of that also had to do with thinking about economic and financial matters. But they really are able to expand on a lot of this in 1948 itself, when one of the earliest areas that they're able to take over in the Civil War. So the Civil War that rages between the nationalists and the communists typically is dated from 1945 to 1949. The first couple of years are actually quite keenly fought, but by 47 itself, the communists have gained the upper hand. And in 48, they are able to retake or conquer, depending on which side you're on, the northeastern parts of China. These are parts that were in the preceding decades actually under Japanese imperial control, because the Japanese had invaded China in the 1930s and had established essentially what was a protectorate called Manchukuo in the northeastern parts. So this is one of the parts that they are able to take over by 48 itself and begin to implement certain kinds of basic reforms, begin to start governance there. And it is there that they make not so much a theoretical distinction, the kinds of things that I was describing a little earlier about, well, how do we define statistics? Is it a social science? Is it a natural science, universal science? Not those kinds of questions. They actually start implementing in practice the implications of statistics as a social science. And in some ways, when 1949 comes around and when there are discussions of, okay, now that we are in control of the country, we can actually go about setting up the basic institutions that will help us revolutionize Chinese economy, culture, society. Where do we look? And it's like, well, we already have a model, because in the Northeast, we've already been expanding this kind of statistical apparatus. So the Northeast then becomes a model for the expansion of the across the entire country, right? So in that sense, this originary moment becomes really important, I think, to understand sort of a whole range of things that happen over the course of the next few years, and you could argue over the next several decades.
And because you mentioned it, what is socialist statistics and how would that sort of be different from capitalist statistics?
Right. Well, so they called it bourgeois statistics. So sometimes they would also say capitalist statistics, but it is very much that distinction, right? That statistics, the point being, statistics is not a universal science. If it's a science of society, then the nature of the society, the nature of economic relations in that society should be important, should actually factor into the kind of statistics that exists, right? So what they say with social statistics is that they're saying at a definitional level, statistics is a social science. It's not a natural science. It's not a universal science. It's a social science whose only object is society, right? The study of society, human beings, their actions, and so on. So that's at the meta level, the distinction that's made. At the practical level, as I've alluded to it, what it means is that they're rejecting all kinds of probabilistic methods, all kinds of mathematical methods that rely upon probabilistic sort of principles. At a very practical level, what this means then is that there are certain methodologies that get rejected outright, and you generate basically what you can think of as a hierarchy of methods. Most important in that hierarchy is the acceptance that the only way to count, the only correct way to count anything in the social world is to count it exhaustively, right? That is to go out there and count every instance of whatever you're interested in. The most obvious and the most easy example, I think, for us to understand is the census, right? If you are trying to calculate the number of people in a given, say, country or even in a given city or province, you have a few different ways to do this. The most obvious, the oldest way is the census method, which is you go out there and just count everyone. If you're in a classroom, it's very easy. You can just, have every student essentially count themselves, and you'll know, well, I have 30 students in the classroom, or however many. It gets a little trickier if you're looking at a city or a region and so on, because there's a lot of work to do. You need to hire a lot of people to go from house to house to find out who lives where. But then you have to be mindful that people don't always stay in one place. They're traveling for work, they're traveling for personal reasons. So, how do you account for those kinds of differences, and a whole range of other errors that might creep in. So the other way, of course, of doing this is by saying, well, we don't need to count everyone. We can devise mathematical techniques of sampling where we can decide randomized sampling, which is the important thing. We can collect a sample that's selected randomly and through mathematical means ensure that it's representative of the larger population. And once we sample that smaller randomized sample, we can extrapolate the results to find out what the population might be, right? So in the case of, to think about it in terms of a school, you can say that, well, we broadly know that each class is roughly is representative, right? There's not a lot of variation in classes, so we can select any class at random, and if we count its students, then we can extrapolate based on that an average classes, there are these many classes, so these many students in the school. That methodology of randomized sampling is what is fundamentally rejected within socialist statistics. So in that hierarchy, you have the census method, which becomes really the primary method, the way in which they really want to count everything, whether it's grain yield, steel production, number of people, the number of buses in a city, and so on. The only way to do is to count exhaustively. And in many cases, the way they do that is not just through the census method, but through a method of periodic reports, right? So they ask the institutions that oversee these activities to submit, say, a monthly report or a bi-monthly report, and these then reports get compiled to produce sort of macro comprehensive data. Having rejected, there's also an ancillary method that falls within socialist statistics. Having rejected random sampling and large-scale random sampling as a method, they don't reject sampling outright. They say that in some cases you can sample, but the sampling they speak of is really what we would call, statisticians of that period called it qualitative sampling. We could think of it as ethnographic research, which is basically the idea that I'm going to go in and intensely study a particular place and then assume that that place is actually representative of a larger social reality. But there is no way in which I can actually demonstrate this, so there's a certain degree of implicit bias, implicit belief in the representability of that particular place, right? So an easy example that both shows the strengths and the flaws of this is, the strength, of course, is that you really fine-grained information, right? So you can say, well, I want to understand what urban life in India is like. Instead of doing a survey of several cities, from mega cities to second-tier cities to towns and so on, the researcher, decide, well, I'm in Delhi, it's kind of convenient, so I'll just stay in Delhi, I don't need to travel, and I'll rigorously research sort of socioeconomic conditions in Delhi, and then I'll claim that represents what the reality in India is. Now, of course, you can imagine what the problems are, right? Delhi is not representative of urban life in India. Delhi and Bombay are significantly richer than most other cities, both large and small in India. So the picture I'm going to present about socioeconomic conditions, about urban life in India, will be heavily skewed. But this is a method that they did use, this kind of qualitative sampling in the 1950s. But they used it only where they felt they could not do the kind of exhaustive enumeration, the kind of periodic reports that they were really relying upon. So to answer the question about what is socialist statistics, it's sort of this, you can think of this in this sort of three-stage process, where first it is that rejection at a meta level, a rejection that statistics is a universal science. It is fundamentally a social science whose sole object is society, whose sole object of research, which then means that you are rejecting all. The second stage is that you're rejecting all probabilistic methods, and then that gets you to the actual methods that they do privilege, which is exhaustive enumeration. So that sort of is a sort of a quick way to understand what the basics of socialist statistics are.
No, that's very good because, I think it really drives the point home when you sort of raise the comparison of using sort of ethnographic surveys to look at Delhi as sort of representative of Indian cities. And I could hear like a million people stand up in arms when you use that example.
Absolutely. People will be upset, right? And with good reason. But at the same time, it's the attraction to ethnographic research really is that I can get down on the ground, because I'm in Delhi, as I said, I did it. My choice of Delhi was purely self-serving, right? I'm in Delhi. It's easy. I don't have to travel anywhere. But the advantage on the flip side is that I can observe personally a lot of the things that I write about and enumerate, right? I can travel around the city, walk around, meet people from different walks of life, observe how they live their lives, and use that kind of very personalized information, personally gained, experiential information in some ways to inform my research, right? And this has a tremendous value also, right? Because what the kind of statistics that say exhaustive enumeration is doing is really taking out this kind of granular detail in the interest of macro level sort of results. And this kind of experiential, almost empiricist approach to ascertaining social reality in the Chinese context actually has its main proponent was Mao Zedong himself, who wrote a very influential report in the late 1920s, in 1927, on sort of social conditions in certain villages, in 5 villages around his home state and the city he was from, around Changsha in Hunan province. And he really extolled this method. He said, this is the only way in which you can understand social reality. And he said, and this is where I know that the peasantry in China are ready for revolution. They are absolutely pissed with the conditions that exist. They're pissed with the landlords. They're pissed with sort of the bourgeois class in the cities. And therefore, this is where we need to go to lead a revolution. So we need to set aside the more canonical Marxist understanding that we need to mobilize labor, urban labor, and lead urban labor in a revolt against the bourgeois. He said that may apply in Western Europe. That doesn't apply to China. In China, the revolutionary forces are actually the peasantry, right? And he claimed that he knew this because he did this kind of very deep-seated ethnographic research. And in the 50s, as I described in the book, this is a source of tension because now you have two competing ways of thinking about how to ascertain social fact. You have this statistics as a social science, therefore use exhaustive enumeration and the periodical report system. But then you have this underlying sort of what you can call this Maoist ethnographic method that exists. And it's partly the clash of the two and the relative dominance of the ethnographic method in 58 and 59 during the Great Leap Forward that contributes in some ways to the inability of the state to figure out that there's a famine and the extent of the famine once they've actually ascertained that there is a famine. So that again, and it goes back to the first question you asked. These things I think would not have been clear if I had focused only on the famine. Right? You need to look at these earlier moments and try and trace the debates as they evolved, the kind of tussle between the initial dominance of socialist statistics, but the fact that this ethnographic mode also exists, it's there, and becomes a source of tension later in the decade. Understanding these sort of the dynamic and the organic nature of this sort of evolution in some ways, right?
Yeah, I think, it makes sense for me now, at least, to look at sort of the different methods for collecting data and then say, well, I guess the sort of method would depend on the sort of decisions that you want to take and
exactly
the sort of things that you want from that data.
Exactly. So in this case, you can imagine when you in under socialist statistics, when you say, okay, we're going to enumerate everything exhaustively, you can immediately imagine that this might be a lot easier in the industrial sector, where in the end you're focused on factories, whether they're large or they're small scale, but their factories by their very nature are confined. They're confined in space. They have a set number of people working, and what they produce is also relatively confined because then it's transported in certain ways. So it's much easier for the industrial sector to actually produce periodic reports, and for the state then to get a sense of what industrial production is like. Um, the other factor, of course, is that in the 50s, the industrial sector in China is relatively small, right? So it's also localized in specific places. It's localized around Shanghai, and it's localized in the northeastern parts, the parts that were under Japanese control in the 30s and 40s. There's very little industry in other places. So it's, again, because it's localized in space, it's easy to count. Contrast that with the agrarian sector, the agricultural sector, which is massive. China has a similar kind of agrarian history as India does, a similar kind of variation in geography, in topography, in climate, and also in grains. The fact that much like there's a division in India also to some extent, where there's a lot more wheat in the north, a lot more rice in the south and the east. There's a similar kind of distinction in China, a lot more wheat in the north, a lot more rice in the south. But then, of course, there's a whole range of other agricultural products also. So how do you actually do this kind of exhaustive enumeration when you have over 700,000 villages and you have a territory that is about 3 times the size of India? You can immediately imagine that this completely falls apart, right? And the result is, but at the same time, there is a tremendous pressure on statisticians working at the village level and the county level to report data. They have to report data in a timely way because otherwise everything falls apart. What do you do in those circumstances? You have not been able to collect the data accurately. You have pressure from your bosses saying, "Where's the data? Send it to us." You're being incentivized to estimate. You're being incentivized to not fabricate, but massage things, right? So it's not that you're outright lying, but you are maybe, well, we knew that last year it was this much. It's likely that this year hasn't changed much, so let's just maybe increase it by a little bit and send it up, something like that, right? So, but then these kinds of estimations, these kinds of sort of errors add up as you go further up the system, as you try and aggregate from village to county to province, eventually to the national level. So by 55, 56 itself, Chinese statisticians were very aware that even if in the industrial sector, this mode of exhaustive enumeration was doing a reasonably good job, in the agricultural sector, they were all over the place. They were completely they had no confidence whatsoever in the numbers they had about their own agricultural production.
This makes me wonder about social statistics. You mentioned earlier that the Chinese statisticians, even back in the 30s and 40s, were sort of integrated with global discourses about how the discipline of statistics was evolving. And we know that the Soviet Union had a huge influence on the Communist Party.
Absolutely.
And how did that sort of influence the way Chinese statisticians looked at these debates?
This is a hugely important question, not just as you rightly point out, not just for the history of statistics, but the history of this period in sort of China's evolution or China's sort of economic and pretty much every facet of Chinese history, because the Soviet Union and China in the 1950s were extremely close, and the Soviet Union was seen by Mao himself, but also by a lot of other Chinese, partly through propaganda and other means, as really an older brother who in some ways had figured socialism out because they'd been doing it for 30 years. So it became really a model for emulation. And again, this again speaks to that earlier point about teleology that I think keeps coming back, right? From our perspective, we think of the Soviet model as, in the end, not being able to sustain itself and crumbling under its own weight, partly because of the Cold War and the kinds of, perverse competition it entailed in terms of building up military arsenals and so on, and the fact that, the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. That sort of clouds our memory in some ways, or our understanding of what the Soviet experiment was. But in the 30s and 40s, into the early 50s, the Soviet Union was really for a lot of people, a very, very successful way to modernize essentially an old agrarian society and make it industrial. right? On top of that, think about the fact that the Soviet Union had played what many would argue was actually the decisive role in defeating Germany and the Axis powers in the Second World War, right? So the legitimacy it enjoyed amongst certain people who maybe personally had already a certain degree of sympathy, or maybe even more so commitment to Marxist modes of thinking about history, thinking about society. The Soviet Union was an obvious sort of model and an obvious success to look at. And that's very much, I think, the way in which a lot of Chinese leaders in the late 40s and early 50s looked to the Soviet Union and said, well, if we follow what they have done, we will also be able to industrialize very quickly. And of course, the Soviet Union responds in sort of various ways. There's some work that talks about the material help they provided in setting up I think it's over 150 factories during the first 5-year plan in China, which is typically dated from 1953 to 57. Other kinds of financial aid and so on. But actually, the most meaningful aid in the 1950s, one could argue, from the Soviet Union was in technical know-how. Right, so sending over experts and in a range of disciplines, both sciences and social sciences, to help the Chinese build their state, build the institutions, build the scientific disciplines, build the engineering disciplines, and so on. And statistics is very much a part of this. So you have, and in the book, I sort of describe some of the more important statisticians who arrived in China as early as 1950, and then were played sort of a crucial advisory role as the Chinese went about building this whole apparatus that you need if you're going to pursue socialist statistics, right? You need a very large bureaucratic sort of apparatus to manage the data. So that's one respect. And another respect, the Soviet influence is very important, because a lot of these debates about what is statistics, is it a social science, sort of these definitional debates were also going on in the Soviet Union. And it's actually not until 1954 that the Soviet state formally provides this definition. So there was, in practice, this was already happening in the 40s into the 50s in the Soviet Union, but it's only in 54 that there's a conference that's held in Moscow where they bring together several hundred scientists from various disciplines, from the social sciences to the hard sciences to medicine, engineering, more applied things, to really deliberate on what is statistics. And it's at that conference that they formally say statistics is a social science. So they essentially formalize what has already been happening in practice by declaring that statistics is a by definition social science. And this whole conference and its formal declaration then has a huge impact in China also, because then they use this, again, what they had been doing in practice, what they had been debating internally, then they use this as, okay, now we have there's the official imprimatur of the Soviet Union. So obviously we're doing it the right way. So there's that influence also that's hugely important, I think, when it comes to statistics.
But what's interesting for me is that, while the Soviet Union had obvious influence over Chinese statistics and a lot of other things as well in China, is you also focus on sort of South-South cooperation,
That's
or like
right.
cooperation between India and China. And this is very interesting for me because, there's a lot that's spoken about sort of the bonhomie between India and China during the
That's right.
1950s, particularly between like Nehru and maybe Zhao.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very interesting for me to look at that through sort of the lens of statistics and statisticians. Mm-hmm. How did that come about?
Yeah, so this is really interesting, and it speaks to, I think, both how much we know about China and India in the 1950s and how much we don't know in some ways. So, a simple way to think about this is that there has been so much, as you said, celebration of the bonhomie and sort of the spirit of Hindi chini bhai bhai and these kinds of things. But a lot of that really focuses on the cultural sphere, right, or the diplomatic sphere. And what we tend to neglect, I think, is that there were exchanges that were happening in other areas. And as I discover in the case of statistics, in areas of science and economic policy and planning, sort of the more, if you will, the harder areas of governance, as opposed to the more sort of literary, cultural, aesthetics elements of the exchange. And in the case of statistics, what's interesting is that if you look at Indian interest in what's going on in China as far as this kind of nation building and the place of planning and the place of statistics within the planning process is concerned, it goes back very early. So it goes back to as early as 1951, when India played host to, I forget what edition it was, but of the biannual conference of the International Statistical Institute. And P.C. Mahalanobis, who's a very important figure in the history of planning in India and the history of statistics, not just in India, but the history of statistics globally, and who at that time was the founder and the director of the Indian Statistical Institute. He was a key player in bringing the conference to India, and he was very interested in trying to get the Chinese to participate, to bring them into a discussion about what should the role of statistics be in a post World War II sort of era, where there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of faith in the idea that statistics and other modes of quantitative reasoning, other modes of quantitative analysis can help us solve uh, all the pressing problems that we face. And so this is also the moment actually where development econ really takes wing. And again, it's driven by a similar kind of, you could say, optimism, a similar kind of maybe even hubris that it's going to be able to solve questions of global poverty, global inequality, and so on, purely by collecting a lot of data and being able to and then analyze that data to understand what's going on. So that the interest on the Indian side is there from a very early stage again, and it's tied also to the fact that Mahalanobis was very close to Nehru. Nehru liked people like Mahalanobis, I guess, people who were scientifically brilliant, but also had a particular interest in public policy and in engagement in public life. So he attracted such people to him. He was attracted by such people, and Nehru had a particular understanding of a longer durée understanding of both Indian and Chinese history and the kinds of connections that had been fostered over millennia. So I think that also helps in a particular, say, openness and eagerness to engage with China across all fronts, including statistics. So the exchange starts as early as 1951, where Mahalanobis and the Indian Statistical Institute are very keen to invite Chinese participation in this conference. But it doesn't at that stage go anywhere, partly because of what we discussed just now, which is that the Chinese had said, no, our model is the Soviet Union. So we are not going to try and get involved with this other community, which is clearly also penetrated by the bourgeois West, the US, and other capitalist countries, and it's not clear what's going on. We don't trust them. The UN also we don't entirely trust. Of course, you'll recall that the People's Republic of China is not a member of the UN, right? It's the Republic of China, Taiwan at this point, that's a member of the UN. So there are all those kinds of considerations that basically inform their decision that they won't participate. What's interesting is that as the decade wears on and their adoption of this Soviet-inspired socialist statistics really gets actualized on the ground, they have the systems, they start collecting the data, they encounter this massive problem in the agricultural sector, as I again just alluded to. So by about 55, 56, there is, I think, a much greater degree of frustration with aspects of this exhaustive enumerative model than there was in 1950, 51, 52. So I think there is a degree of openness to, well, let's see what else is going on. Yes, even though theoretically we are kind of against probabilistic methods, let's be open and think. And the reason why I say let's be open to probabilistic methods is because what has been happening in India during this time is precisely a lot of innovation and implementation of large-scale random sampling. So Mahalanobis, actually as early as the 1930s, was one of the pioneers in trying to apply what in the 20s were still largely theoretical ideas about how do you use probabilistic methods to carry out large-scale surveys. He was one of the early people to demonstrate that you could do this in the field. He did it with crop, I think, jute and rice crops in Bengal in the 1930s, and then he expanded that in the 1940s. So the institute that he set up, the Indian Statistical Institute, by the end of the 1940s had become a global center for this kind of research and this kind of innovation, interestingly, attracting people not just from one side of the Iron Curtain after, say, the Second World War, and in the 50s in particular, once the Cold War had become quite a reality. So you had people from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc and people from the Western countries all participating in seminars, spending time at the Indian Statistical Institute. So it was a real place of both innovation, but also of intermingling. And as I said, one of their main achievements was devising and demonstrating how powerful random sampling could be, large-scale random sampling could be, if you're trying to ascertain very large social phenomena, whether it's agricultural yield, population, and so on. And so it's partly the importance of the Indian Statistical Institute at this time. It's partly the frustration that the Chinese statisticians are feeling with their own methods. And then you have this very contingent sort of exchange of, not exchange, but from the Indian side, there's a delegation that travels to China in 56, which is a delegation that is sent by the Indian Planning Commission. and its members. So Mahalanobis was supposed to lead this delegation, but he falls ill. He's not able to. But another very important figure in the history of Indian planning, a man by the name of Pitambar Pant, he leads it. And this is the first instance where the Chinese planners and statisticians engage at a very sort of robust level with what is going on in terms of planning and statistics in India. And that provides them a sense that, oh, there's actually interesting things going on, and we should be at least open to understanding a little bit better what might be happening. And then a second rather pivotal event in this series of exchanges is Zhou Enlai's visit to India in late 1956, where interestingly he makes time to visit the Indian Statistical Institute in Calcutta. And he is deeply impressed by what he sees and deeply inspired by what he sees. And I think once you get that kind of top level political investment, so it's no longer just a question of the technocrats and the leaders, but these are not national leaders, the people who say head the stats bureau or head the planning commission, but now you have someone like the prime minister Zhou Enlai himself on board. That then facilitates a much more robust series of exchanges that begins in 1957, where the Chinese really become interested in random sampling and how it might be used in particular across all of their statistical activities, but with a particular emphasis on the agricultural sector. How do we maybe start employing this to get a better sense of our own sort of agricultural yield and other kinds of data like this? So that's sort of how it progresses through the 50s. It's various different factors coming together, some on the Indian side, some on the Chinese side, and some more globally that facilitate this exchange.
Yeah, I think it's just fascinating because you don't imagine sort of statistics to be the site for cooperation in a traditional sense. And I think that's what's really cool about it. The fact that, a year after that, you mentioned how Mahalanobis and Pitambar Pant go back for lectures in China.
That's right. So not Pitambar Pant, Mahalanobis and the statistician D.B. Lahiri. They are the two.
Sorry,
yeah, no. That's there's a lot of names, but they go back, and you're right. They spent 3 weeks in 1957 lecturing, and these lectures are fairly detailed, fairly technical. The Chinese produce a detailed book afterwards, and there is a lot of discussion in China about what they're learning. And then they also in 58 sent Chinese statisticians to India, who are then in Calcutta at the Indian Statistical Institute for a year, essentially learning sampling methods, studying sampling methods, so that they can bring this back. And this is where, interestingly, it goes back to an earlier question you'd asked, right, about legacies. So the statisticians, there are two important statisticians who spent all of 1958 in India studying and working and studying. They were a younger generation that was actually trained right before the establishment, that received their college training right before the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 49. So in some ways they were exposed to that earlier mode of statistics as a much more universal science, but then had to recalibrate their own sort of approach in the early years of the PRC. And then in 58 were exposed again to a lot of this more mathematical statistics. These people, after 78, when again China becomes more open to rethinking what statistics might be, take on leadership roles, right? So it's interesting to track some of these career trajectories and see the ups and downs, and when they are prominent, when they get marginalized, and when they are again asked to become part of sort of institutional reform. So these two people have their own biographies that are actually quite interesting to track. But your broader point, I think, about it's surprising that statistics would you'd see exchange and so much interest in statistics is worth pondering, right? Because statistics, I think, and the broader category of science that it is embedded within is something that we have neglected, I think, when we think about China India, especially post 47, post 49 China India history. And so one of the things that I've been doing, partly motivated by my own discovery of the statistical exchanges for this book, is to start mapping out other exchanges that were taking place in the realms of science, not necessarily only starting in the 50s, but going back to the 1920s and 30s. And I'm finding all sorts of very interesting cases, some of which deal with specific disciplines, some of which deal with much more applied technologies. And I'm in the midst of sort of collecting material to try and sort of see, well, what can we say about histories of science then and histories of technology in China and India, when we make China and India sort of the basis of comparison for each other, or the two nodes of connection. And this in some ways speaks to a larger debate in the history of science, whether you look at the history of science in South Asia or the history of science in East Asia, because the standard mode really has been one where we take the point of reference to really be actors in the West, scientists in the West, activities in the West, right? So whether it's Indian science, whether it's Chinese science, in the Chinese science, Japanese scientists also play a similar role. But rarely do we look at countries that are in the global South and what kinds of exchanges are taking place between countries in the global South when it comes to the sciences. So part of what I'm trying to do is, well, what new insights might we gain if we do this if we shift our frame somewhat and set aside the obvious sort of point of reference, which is the West, and look at each other, look at China and India, and the kinds of scientific exchanges that were taking place.
That sounds really cool because I think, particularly when you're talking about the sciences, you talk about sort of like technology transfers and things like that, but you don't typically think of exchanges between countries in the global South.
Exactly. And so the other, interesting debate that exists within the broader field of the history of science and technology, right, is these questions of innovation and whether a particular technology is cutting edge and it represents some kind of sort of the pushing of the scientific or technical frontier. But I think what gets left out in a lot of this is that there are other kinds of technologies that are grassroots technologies that might be a combination of taking the most advanced principles but then using local materials, local conditions, and devising sort of solutions that are actually much more local and don't have to do with some kind of very aesthetically and technically advanced design, but a design that's actually much more functional. These kinds of things are happening in many countries in the global South. And I think there is a history of these countries trying to learn from each other. And this is a history that we are still relatively, I think, um, ignorant is perhaps too strong a word, but we have neglected this kind of history. So we don't really understand why the degree to which it might be important. I'll just to give you one example. Statistics is not necessarily a grassroots technology. It is actually a pretty, especially in the 50s with random sampling, which is the cutting edge frontier of statistics. Actually, at that time, we're talking about a kind of exchange that happens in the global South, but that's also at the frontiers of science at that time, or science and technology. But there are other examples, and one that I've been collecting materials on, which I think is quite fascinating, is this question of biogas, which in India, you would call gobar gas, but in effect, the broader term is biogas, right? It's not just cow dung, but any kind of organic material as it rots. There's fermentation, generates gas, and if you tap that gas, you can then use it for all kinds of productive means. And there was a tremendous attempt in various countries to promote this in various agrarian countries where there would be a lot of biomass, which would then generate a lot of biogas, to sort of use this as a way of producing energy at the local level in the rural countryside. And I'm discovering that there was a very interesting set of exchanges that took place between Indian and Chinese scientists, engineers, and also technicians, sort of bureaucrats, technocrats, in the late 70s, where they each sought to learn about the kinds of biogas technologies they developed and the kinds of biogas policies they pursued. Again, this is something that we don't really know much about, but it speaks to a very different kind of technology, perhaps a technology that most people would not want to, they would look down upon because it seems so basic in some ways and, for other reasons, messy, but it can be transformative, right? And there's a whole history, of course, of biogas and how transformative is it and is it really useful? But I think there are interesting things to potentially explore there. Again, just one simple example, these questions of how do we think about innovation and technical efficiency versus practicability, right? So these kinds of things, which are in some ways core problems when we think about history of technology. And this exchange with biogas, I think, really opens up interesting perspectives on that, because the Chinese approach and the Indian approach was actually quite different, and it led to very different kinds of outcomes. So that can be quite instructive.
Yeah, I'm looking forward then to your next book.
Well, this may not be the next book. I'm collecting these case studies. The next book is most likely going to be about something else. But
Well, on that note, this is my last question to you, and this is something that I ask all of my guests. But what books or what resources would you recommend for people who want to explore more about statistics, about early exchanges between India and China?
So that's two different questions, right? So on statistics, or as in two different subjects in some ways. On statistics, I think there is a few which are now canonical books, I guess, the kinds of books that everyone who's interested in the history of science will read at some point. So I'll mention some of them. And I think I've actually mentioned some of them already in our conversation. So this might ring a bell. So there's Ian Hacking wrote a book called The Taming of Chance, Ian Hacking is a mathematician and a philosopher. He wrote this book called The Taming of Chance, which is precisely, tracking that moment where we became comfortable with the idea of probability and chance as a feature of the human world, right? So it's not something we can't understand. It's actually something that we can calculate and figure out within a degree of probability what is the likelihood of an event happening and so on. So that book, Ian Hacking, The Taming of Chance, a book that's in a similar vein, also very influential, by Theodore Porter, called The Rise of Statistical Thinking. And Ted Porter actually has a whole range of books that are very interesting to read if you're interested in the history of statistics. In addition to The Rise of Statistical Thinking, there's a book called Trust in Numbers, which is again a fascinating analysis of the ways in which society has become quantified and what the implications of that quantification are in some ways. And more recently, he wrote a book on the biography of the statistician Carl Pearson, which is also really interesting. Carl Pearson, many people would regard as the founder of what we think of as modern statistics. So some of the concepts that we take for granted today, you'd learn in an intro stats class, for instance, correlation, regression, these kinds of concepts. He's the one who really came up with them and formalized them. There's another book that looks at a slightly earlier moment in the history of probability when it was primarily the domain of people interested in pure mathematics or people interested in games of chance, things like that. There's a book called Classical Probability in the Age of Enlightenment. I'm blanking on the full title now, but it's by Lorraine Daston, who is again a very prominent historian of science, and has written several important works, not just in the history of probability, but in other areas also. And then the one other book I'll mention in this regard that comes to mind is a book by the French sociologist, I'm not probably going to pronounce it right, but Alain Desrosiers. And this is a book called The Politics of Large Numbers. And this is again a fascinating sort of analysis of the ways in which quantification has entered society and the implications of that dominance, the rise of a kind of quantitative mode. Oh, and I can mention one other book that's more recent. That's not about sort of these general histories. It's actually much more about U.S. history, but it's really interesting because it looks at the ways in which risk, which is another way of thinking about probability, right? Is what is the risk of something happening, and how do we? There's a whole now industry, right? Insurance is fundamentally a history of how you calculate risk and then figure out premiums and so on. But there's a book by a historian of science called Dan Bouk, B-O-U-K, Dan Bouk, which is called How Our Days Became Numbered. So it's about the ways in which risk entered into thinking about individuals and the ways in which you think about individual lives and so on. And so that's a really, really fascinating story too there. So those are some suggestions on the history of statistics that are fairly canonical. The first several ones are fairly canonical ones. On China, India, there's actually not a lot that has been written from the perspectives that we have discussed, really. But there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm now to reassess sort of what China-India history might be like. And there's a volume that's coming out, I think, called Beyond Pan-Asianism. It's an edited volume, edited by Tan Sen and Brian Tsui, who teaches in Hong Kong. Tan Sen teaches in Shanghai. He's Indian, but teaches in Shanghai. Brian's from Hong Kong. And they've put together a whole range of essays that speak to different aspects of connections and comparisons between China and India, but they're all sort of pre-49. But they're still fascinating because they're completely new in terms of the kinds of topics they cover. So that's one book that's just come out, or maybe will be out in the next month, that might be of interest to the audience. There's another book by Tan Sen, which is called, I'm now again blanking on the exact title, but it's China, India, Connected History, I think.
Yeah, it's called India, China, and the World, Connected
There
History.
you go. Thank you so much. Yeah. So that's a fantastic book also to try and, I think, understand the depth and range of connections. And one of the important points that Tan Sen makes in the book actually is that we shouldn't only look at sort of the landmass of present day China, the landmass of present day India, and see connections just in these two places, but to recognize that there were people, objects, and ideas that were in constant circulation all over Asia. And many of these were Indic or Sinic in origin in some ways. So a lot of the interesting stories that emerge don't have to be geographically bounded by the present, sort of the modern day nation states of China and India. Right. So if we're to really understand these exchanges and the longer durée histories, those kinds of connections are really, really important to study. And then he brings the story up into the 20th century also. So those are two books that come to mind immediately. There's a lot of articles that have been written recently that look at different aspects of how do we think about China and India. I'll mention one other book that's just come out that's actually very interesting. It's a book by Andrew Liu, and it's a history of tea. I think it's called T-War, A History of Capitalism in China and India. And that's, again, a fascinating book because it's focusing on a moment when the locus of tea production, the locus of global tea production, shifts from China, southeastern China, the province of Fujian and other coastal Zhejiang, other coastal areas, to India's northeast, to Assam, the Assam Valley, and other places, right? And he's trying to then situate this transition within a broader history of capitalism and argue that these sites were actually just as fundamental to the evolution of capitalism as we understand it. Histories of capitalism tend to focus entirely on what's happening initially in Western Europe, in places like England and Manchester and so on, and then eventually in America. And he says that it's actually a much more globally interconnected process. And in that process, sites like China and India were actually fundamental. And in his case, he uses tea as a way of sort of exploring that. So that's another book that's very interesting. It's new, and it connects China and India in a way that's not just relevant to Indian and Chinese history, but is actually relevant to global history.
All right, that is a big reading list and one that I need to get started on soon. But thank you so much, Arunabh. Thank you.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed talking, and I hope it was, for the most part, not unintelligible and clear.
No, it was very, very intelligible and clear and very fascinating.
Oh, thank you.
That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us. I've attached links to all of Arunabh's recommendations in the episode description, so do check them out. If you have any comments or criticisms, then feel free to reach out to me at Hamsini H on Twitter or at States of Anarchy on Instagram. If you liked this episode, then I would love it if you left us a rating on Apple Podcasts so that other people can discover us too. If you want to explore more of the world of foreign policy and strategic studies, let me suggest the policy courses at the Takshashila Institution. They do some really cool research and offer policy courses of various lengths. So do check them out at www.takshashila.org.in. I hope you're safe and healthy during this difficult time and that you'll tune into the next episode. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app or website, but also on Spotify, iTunes, Savan, Google Podcasts, or whatever you're using right now to listen to this. Happy listening.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।
Hi, my name is Anupam Gupta. I'm B50 on Twitter. I am the host of Paisa Paisa, the show that talks money. On my show, I speak to experts from every field of money and finance, from stock markets, equities, debt funds, credit cards, life insurance, every possible area of money and finance that you can think of. We even did an episode on cryptocurrency. I've got fantastic guests from mutual funds to personal finance experts everywhere. Robo-advisory, startups, just name it, we've got it. At Paisa Paisa, we help you make smart decisions about money. You work hard for money. Now make your money work hard for you. New episodes out every Monday, and you can listen to my show on the IVM Podcast app or any other podcasting app that you have.